Welcome to Virtual Sentiments, a podcast on the ethics and politics of digital technology with an eye to the past. I'm your host, Kristen Collins, Senior Fellow and Political Theorist at the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. With today's episode, we premiere our fourth season of the podcast. And we start this season with a very special celebration of the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's landmark book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, originally published on March 9, 1776. Smith's first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, inspired the name of this podcast, but Wealth of Nations is his best-known work, cementing him as a foundational figure in the history of economics, but well-read by philosophers, political scientists, and others throughout the academy today. In today's episode, I talked to Dr. Maria Pia Paganelli. She is a professor of economics at Trinity University, specializing in 18th century economic thought, including Adam Smith, David Hume, monetary theories, and the Scottish Enlightenment. She has published many works on Smith and economics, including the Routledge Guidebook to Smith's Wealth of Nations. And until recently, she was the president of the International Adam Smith Society. As Maria emphasizes throughout our conversation, there are many valid and valuable interpretations of Smith's work, and so we don't mean to suggest this is the only way to interpret him. But a focus of this episode is on appreciating Smith as a social critic with a keen eye for the complexity of power in both its public and political forms, as well as wielded by private actors, such as in the dynamics between workers and employers, for example. For Smith, understanding what makes us wealthy was a project that was very much tied to his critique of established institutions, which on the whole tended to enrich some at the expense of all. So without further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Maria as much as I did. On today's episode of Virtual Sentiments, I'm talking to Dr. Maria Pia Paganelli. She has published many works on Smith and economics, and among the many reasons that I wanted to talk to her today and that I thought she'd be perfect for helping us celebrate the 250th anniversary of Smith's An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, or as we typically say, Wealth of Nations, is that she is the author of the Routledge Guidebook to Smith's Wealth of Nations, and until very recently served as the president of the International Adam Smith Society. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Kristen. It's a great pleasure.
So I wanted to start off, giving a basic introduction because we have a very wide variety of listeners. Some people are listening to this already, having read Smith and even maybe writing on Smith, working on Smith, but a lot of people haven't. And this year they're probably going to be hearing more of him with this anniversary. So what do you think we should start knowing about Adam Smith and the historical context in which this book was released?
Well, Adam Smith was born in Scotland, and we just a couple of years ago we celebrated his 300th birthday. He was raised only by his mother because his father passed before he was born. He was educated in a local parish school and then the University of Glasgow. And then he went to Oxford to continue his studies. Really didn't like it. Um, went back to Scotland, and then he started lecturing public lectures in Edinburgh. Eventually got a position at the University of Glasgow, teaching logic in the chair of logic, teaching moral philosophy and jurisprudence. He was a very good professor, from what the students seem to say. And he published a first book, which was the theory of moral sentiments, which gave him a lot of fame. After that, because of the reputation that he received, he was asked to be the private tutor of a local noble, of a child of a local noble. And he took on the task. So he left the University of Glasgow to do the so-called Grand Tour of Europe, which was a typical way in which the youth of nobles would be educated at the time. And then when he came back, actually, when he was in the Grand Tour, when he was in France, he was waiting to be welcomed in certain circles, and apparently got bored. And so he wrote home saying, "I'm very bored. Just to pass my time, I'm going to write a book." And that's how we started to write the Wealth of Nations. So the Wealth of Nations apparently was started as a pastime out of boredom when it was in France.
Amazing.
And then he went back to Scotland. He worked as a custom officer, lived with his mom till she died, and then he died a few years after. The context in which he lived, so he lived in Scotland in 18th century, which is a time of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. Scotland before the 18th century was a very, very poor country, or is very poor, not very, very poor, but it was poor. Certain parts more than others, especially the Highlands. But with the union with England, then it got access to international markets. So Glasgow was the best port to reach the colonies. So he basically boomed, and that allowed for Scotland to develop significantly and to experience an immense economic growth in relatively few decades. That allowed also for a very, very, very bubbling intellectual environment, so that the universities as well as local clubs, they call them, that are basically circles or societies where people would meet and chat over topics, and people of all diverse background, of all kind of backgrounds would meet and discuss all sort of current events, intellectual things, and so that allowed for a lot of interactions and a lot of intellectual stimulations. And so that's basically the context in which Smith lived intellectually. Just to think in terms of who else was in his circle, aside, of course, David Hume. But so it's not just philosophers, but like the most important botanist of the time were in his circles, the most important physicians of the time were in his circle, the uh, the most important geologists were in his circle, chemists. So all sort of intellectuals from all different background were dining together and discussing things together basically on a daily basis.
Wow, yes. I was gonna say, I did read recently, in cite one of your articles on, Smith discussing the debate about the standing army, the question of armies in the poker club. Would you mind just expanding that a little bit, just as an example of the kind of intellectual atmosphere?
Right. So the poker club is one of those clubs that would bring together men, differently from France, because in France there's an equivalent of it, but the saloons are run by women. So there is a co-head presence in Scotland is only men. But anyway, these clubs would meet regularly, either on a weekly base or a bi-weekly base or a monthly base, and they would either have meal together, drinks together, and then have topics that they would debate. And the poker club in particular would deal mostly with challenges of defense. And in particular, at that time, there was a debate whether to have a standing army or militia. And so people, again, from all sort of disciplines would get together and discuss it. And there were like religious people, people from the military, philosophers, historians, again, chemists, botanists, and whatever you think of a part of the intellectual discourse, and those people were all together debating this.
And so when Wealth of Nations, was released, what was the kind of initial immediate context? You had mentioned that their moral sentiments made him famous, but what was the reaction to Wealth of Nations?
So Smith was a sort of intellectual rock star already when he published The Wealth of Nations, and people knew that he was writing it. He's like a painfully slow writer, according to basically everybody. And so people were very anxious and they were with very high expectation of the book. And in particular, again, the book was published in 1776 in March. And 1776 is also famous because of the Declaration of Independence. So there was a lot of expectation for the release of the book because of the colonial situation. So people were very, very excited about the release of the book. They put a lot of pressure on Smith to actually release the book because it was like, well, there is a comma that is not in the right place. No, I'm just joking. But like,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
but it's like it's a
It's
very
perfectionism.
exactly. So the publisher was like, I don't care, just like get me the manuscript. I want to get it out. And eventually it was published again in March 76, and it sold out immediately. It was a huge success. So the second edition came out basically with no changes very, very quickly after the first, just because the first sold out. So yeah, it was a great, great success.
You brought up his relationship with David Hume, and later on, he would write an obituary for David Hume that was very controversial. And in that letter, where he's reflecting on that, he's surprised by the reaction to that because he expected a much more controversial reaction to Wealth of Nations because it was, in his words, a violent attack on the commercial system of Great Britain. Would you mind explaining that about his own expectations for how it would be received, and what he was expecting?
He describes so the wealth of nation, as you mentioned, as a most violent attack against the commercial system of Britain. But it's not just that. Like he attacks basically every single institution at that time. He attacks the university, he attacks the church, he attacks the empire, and everything on which the empire is based. So yes, he had good reasons to think that there would be some pushback, but there were none. Like he was really loved, and the book was very much loved and welcomed. But if you do pay attention to the language when he writes, he is very much attacking the whole commercial system of Britain with very strong language. So it's not like a subtle, like, oh well, maybe. No, it's like he's saying that the merchants and manufacturers have rapacity in their actions. So is really strong. And again, there's no institution that stands. Like he's really attacking every single possible thing. But no, there was no bad feelings against him.
Well, I think he's such a nuanced writer. I wonder if people didn't always catch it. I mean, I think it's clear from us, but maybe they did. I did appreciate you did have a recent piece on kind of summarizing these different aspects about Adam Smith, the dissenter, which is great. And yeah, I especially also every time I talk about Smith now, I try to hammer home how much I view him as a social critic in so many ways. And Rousseau's the big political theorist. Rousseau's always treated as the big kind of social critic, but Nick Smith's doing his own criticism in a lot of robust ways too.
I mean, he says explicitly so more than once that the entire British Empire is a product of the rapacity of merchants and manufacturers. Is quite strong and explicit in attacking the empire.
Yeah, no, excellent. And so then let's get into that because for some people they might be listening and even if they know about Smith, they might be more focused on the idea of self-interest, for example, in Wealth of Nations. The idea that there is this kind of, appealing to the interest of the butcher, the brewer, the baker when we make a fair exchange with them. And as you say, though, he has a lot of social critique. Is critical of the empire. So, how should we make sense of that, and what is the role that self interest plays in this work, and setting it alongside also his other writings and their moral sentiments, which emphasized sympathy and maybe had a less of an obvious orientation around the things that again anachronistically I think people expect him to be describing kind of a rational actor model, and to some degree, there might be some compatibilities, but that's something we might impose on him too.
Bart Wilson from Chapman University recently published a book called Meaningful Economics. And there he mentions the problem of self interest in the wealth of nations. And because like we tend to associate self interest with the wealth of nation, and famous like wealth of nation is built on the granite of self interest, right? Um, but he actually looked it up, and self-interest is mentioned once in the entire book, and is referring to like the lower clergy of the church.
Yes. Yeah.
The famous sentence of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, which often is associated with self-interest, is actually what Smith actually says is own interest, not self-interest. And apparently, there has been like a change in the literature due to like I cite by heart as opposed to actually look at the citation. So, in the word philosopher is the first time in which at least Bart found the use of self-interest as opposed to own interest in that particular sentence. That said, it is true that at the beginning of the Wealth of Nations, the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, acting in their own interest, are able to make everybody better off in today's language, right? And it is true it is not their intention, but it just works out that you go home with your dinner, and that's in a sense the start. The problem is that when you continue reading, um, it there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of things that are not as harmonious as you get in your buying your dinner from the butcher, the brewer, and the baker. And so when there are in today's language special interest groups, so there are small groups that are able to get together, cartelize, again in today's language, to try to achieve benefit for themselves, and the cost of those benefits are diffused among society, then there is an opportunity for them to enrich themselves at the expense of others. And that is basically what Smith describes in the rest of the Wealth of Nations. And this is why I think he's calling it a violent attack against the commercial system of Britain, because there are groups that are able to, again, in today's language, to cartelize and achieve privileges and benefit themselves at the expense of society. So the problem that I think Smith sees, and again, this is my reading, like there's a gazillion different readings of Smith, but my reading is that his major problem is this special interest group capturing the power of the state and using the force of the state to impose monopolies that benefit themselves, decreasing the growth opportunity for the entire country and the people who need the most, who need growth the most.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that that's an excellent summary. And I think that also gets at a few different aspects that we should both kind of return to from your earlier explanation, the context, and also will help us flesh out the material of the book and the motivating puzzle of the book. Because as I think is already clear here, it's not just like an objective treatise on economics, as you might, as like most big economics books might be that today, or articles, because articles are now, the mode of the discipline primarily. So it was also very normative. It was very political. And it was also very much about institutions. And so it was also about what kind of institutions would shape how people pursued their interests and the incentives that would shape those actions and how to keep avoid those types of problems that he saw in the system as it existed. So I wanted to return to the historical context you underscored, which was the poverty of Scotland before trade flourished after the union with England. And to that, I wanted to return to that because I think that's also the puzzle that he frames the book with this very normative introduction where he's talking about why are some countries wealthy? Why are some poor? And that's not just a matter of, interest, but a matter of people's well-being, of their health, of their the ability to help the most vulnerable in society to avoid practices like exposure that were more common in even ancient Greece, which he talks about in Theory of Moral Sentiments, things like that. So, would you mind maybe helping us situate ourselves in terms of, why is it so important to know the causes of the differences in wealth and both kind of maybe from Smith's perspective and in that time, but then also, why this continues to be a focus of economics today.
The very short answer is because poverty will kill you, and it will kill the most vulnerable first. That's, I think, is the shortest version of it. You mentioned his condemnation of exposure in ancient Greece, but the wealth of nation has plenty of examples that are similar to it. Right? So in his own introduction, where he explains what he's going to do in the wealth of nation, he tells us that there are some nations that are so miserably poor where people are forced to abandon their children, their elderly, and their sick to, and I'm using these words, to be devoured by wild beasts. That's a is a horrifying image, right? It's like imagine that you have a baby and you not only like exposing, you just leave it out, right? Is devoured by a wild beast is very like shocking as an opening image. And then it tells you that in China at his time, people would drown children like puppies because they can't afford to sustain their life. It tells us that in his days in Scotland, in the Highlands, a woman gave birth to 20 children, only to see a couple of them survive. So that's the problem of poverty, right? That the poverty does not allow people who are not able to produce their own food, basically, or to get their own food to survive. And for Smith, that is a tragic situation because again, put it in context of the theory of moral sentiments. What does it tell us? It tells us that the death of a child is the most tragic thing that can happen, right? And we mourn the death of a child. We may not. I mean, we are saddened by the death of an elderly person, but we sort of expect an elderly person to die, but a child, no, right? So we are horrified at the idea that a child dies. And then he opens the wealth of nation by saying a parent will let his children devoured by a wild beast, right? So the contrast is really striking. And so I think that there is a very strong moral problem of how do we allow people to survive. And then I would add to it, if you again put together theory of moral sentiments with wealth of nation, to survive and live well. Because survive is not enough. Smith always talks about the need and conveniences of life, right? So you don't want just to live, you want to live a good life. And I think in theory of moral sentiment, it does tell us that there's certain kind of sociability that can emerge more easily in a rich society than in a poor society. And again, there's nothing inferior or superior in being in different kind of societies, but there's certain conditions that would prevent you from developing certain, it calls it humanity, that allows you to have friendships that are meaningful as opposed to not showing any of the emotion, not showing any of your passion, not showing any of the love that you may have, which is something more typical in poorer society.
Yeah.
So I think that those are the main concerns that he has. Is like how do we let how can people can live and how can they live well?
Yeah, it is actually, philosophers talk a lot about eudaimonia and the idea of flourishing and the good life. And I think to a large degree in both of his works, what Smith is also getting at is the material conditions that enable flourishing. And actually, in a way, I mean, I think it's almost, I think there's a lot of empathy. Like you said, I don't think, it's always hard. It's hard when people are using, in this time language of barbarous versus civilized, for example, those types of things. But I think for the large part, especially compared to other thinkers at the time, he was not so much passing moral judgments as explaining the variations among societies as being very deeply related to material conditions. The material conditions can enable certain social practices and moral norms and emotional norms around emotional expressivity, kind of explicit outward expression, not necessarily the actual feelings. So people can have deep love and sadness and mourn their children without necessarily having the same kind of practices outwardly or language outwardly, or relationships that he's describing. But I wanted to dive in a little bit more deeply again into this topic too of thinking about his appreciation for material inequality, material conditions, and then also the way that institutions shape all of these things. So what then are his answers to the puzzle then? If it is so important that we avoid poverty because it brings death, what is his answer of how is it that communities become wealthy?
Aside the first passage from having close to nothing to having something that allows you to divide labor, with the division of labor, you are able to produce more than what you consume. But that implies that you have to have a market to sell what you have produced and to buy what you haven't produced. So I think like the little chapter 3 of book 1, when titled "The Division of Labor is Limited by the Extent of the Market," is the fundamental key of his understanding of growth. You have to have open markets. You have to have access to markets. And if you do have access to market, then you are able to specialize. And if you're able to specialize, you're able to be more productive. And if you're more productive, you're able to be wealthier. So access to markets, I think, is the fundamental key to economic growth. Think of what he says, just to give to for me, that is like the striking part of, like, to understand how important access to markets are. In the Wealth of Nation, he tells us there are the two most important discovery of mankind: the discovery of the Americas and the route to circumnavigate Africa to arrive in India. Those are the two most important discovery ever made. Right? And it's when I ask people, what do you think are the two most important things that ever happened in history of mankind? Nobody ever mentioned them, right? But for Smith, those are the two most important things, because to circumnavigate around Africa to get to India as opposed to do it on foot means that now you actually have access relatively cheaply to a market. The Americas are new markets. And again, you are able to get there by boat. Sea transport or water transport is immensely cheaper than land transport. Even today, right? Even today, like, I think it's like 90% of the commodities that we consume come by water. And because it's much cheaper than on the ground. And so for him, the fact that now you are able to reach by water two different continents is expanding the markets to a way to a measure that was unthinkable before. And that's why I think he thinks these are the two major discoveries ever made by humankind, because they allow you to enlarge the market. And if you allow more specialization, you're allowed economic growth.
Excellent. But that brings up a question that I think we've already flagged his critique of imperialism and modern colonialism. But would you mind then? I think when people hear that, they would want to know. Well, if it's expanding the markets for some, but then it's introducing domination and trade and slave trade for other peoples, and so how does that fit into Smith's? Because I think that is true that it's very important, but also important doesn't necessarily mean entirely good.
Right. So I think there is another piece to the picture, which is an administration of justice that is fair. So that the administration of justice has to be, or justice has to be just for everybody, and not just for some. So there shouldn't be any privileges of a group at the expense of another. And that's basically what happens with the building of the empire. Because for him, the empire is created by merchants and manufacturers who want to have monopoly power over certain markets and certain routes. And that is treating people differently, because now you're using the state, the power of the state, to protect a certain group at the expense of others, protect in the sense to give privileges to certain groups at the expense of others. And so Smith tells you, yeah, there are a lot of people who think that thanks to our monopolies now we are richer. And he says, no, it's despite the monopolies that we are richer. And we could be much richer if there were no monopolies. So the condemnation of the empire comes, I think, in the same line of the expansion of markets. Because when you have a market that is monopolized, you're basically restricting access to it. And it's access to market that allows you to specialize and become more productive and become richer. But if you don't have access to that market, only if few have access to that market, what you're doing is closing it up and limiting the potential that you would otherwise have. So the access to market has to be an access that is allowed to everybody, not just to a specific few.
And it's interesting too because I think he's showing that the colonial system, the imperial system is enabling also what not the monopolies and then also and I know you talk about this in your work too, enabling the system of mercantilism, which how we would describe the commercial system of Britain that he's attacking, and that it makes mercantilism seem so much more economically efficient and desirable and the path to wealth than it really is. And so would you mind also, for people who aren't familiar, what exactly is mercantilism and how does it fit into this puzzle?
I will not be able to give you a good definition of mercantilism just because I don't think that there is. There are a lot of scholars that actually say mercantilism never existed, is a
Yeah.
made up thing. And most likely Smith is responsible for making this thing up. Well, I can tell you what mercantilism is for Smith, as opposed to mercantilism in general. But for Smith, the problem of mercantilism, which is the problem of Britain, is the fact that there are these special interest groups that are able to use state power to benefit themselves through a series of policies and regulations. And so the whole book four, The Wealth of Nations, each chapter tells you one of the problems that comes with mercantilism that are all restrictions to markets or ways of benefiting a group at the expense of others, and they range from subsidies to tariffs to commercial treaties to colonies. um, and so for him, the mercantilism are all these restrictions that are posed on markets through government intervention that is dictated by specific groups. The more popular version of this, according to Smith and in his time, is that a country is rich if it has a lot of money. So how do we get a lot of money for the country? Well, you put tariffs so the money doesn't leave. You give subsidies so that to exporters so that they can actually export more and receive more money in return. You colonize another country so that you can get exclusive access to that particular market. So the all these restrictions that are in place, the rhetoric is we are going to make the country richer if we are able to get more money in the country or to keep more money in the country. And for Smith, this is complete nonsense because the amount of money is not what makes a country rich. What makes a country rich is the ability to consume. You can have a lot of money, but if you're not able to consume more than before, then you're not richer than before. So it's very explicit about you are rich only when you can consume. And the richer you are, the more you can consume. Money is irrelevant to the situation.
Yeah, interesting. No, and as a non-economist, this is exactly why I need to talk to people like you because I would have a hard time explaining these aspects of the work. And so, what does that mean to be able to consume, and what is that orientation for Smith like to be thinking in terms of the ability to consume?
Are you able to feed your children? Or are your children dying of starvation? Right? That's ability to consume is a very big, I mean, it's a very basic thing. But like, if your children are dying because of diseases, because of malnutrition, if your children are dying because you're not able to give them a food, you're poor, even if you have a pile of money. right? Because that money doesn't buy you anything. And so what Smith is saying, like, no, you are rich if you can buy stuff, if you can consume things. So money is irrelevant. It just like helps you, is a instrument of exchange, but it's not actually what makes you rich. Is how much you are able to feed your children.
Yeah. And
Like
it's well, yeah, and it's an orientation around, not to interrupt, but around more all of the people in a community rather than merely the sort of aggregate wealth that might be held primarily by the special interest groups or something like that.
exactly, exactly. So the amount of gold and silver that is present in the treasury of the state is irrelevant. Is are your people dying or are they surviving? Is the population in your country increasing or not? So for me, one way to see if a country is rich or poor is to see how many people are in that country. Right? If a country has an increasing population, that means that they're able to feed more people, and so the population increases. And if population shrinks, that means that the country is getting poorer.
Yeah. I mean, this is more, do you think, to what degree do you think Smith, being from Scotland and going to Oxford in his youth and seeing the sort of differences within just the Isle of Great Britain, do you think that shaped this work?
More than the difference between the lowlands of Scotland and England, I think that the difference that he would be more concerned about are the differences between the highlands and the lowlands. The lowlands of Scotland, think of Glasgow and Edinburgh, are basically not that different from London or from France. I mean, there are, but like the major intellectuals are flocking to Scotland. Right? Like the Edinburgh Medical School is the best medical school in the world at the time. So I don't think it's the lowlands of Scotland that is a problem. But if you go to the highlands, you do have that woman with 20 children and only two of them survive. So the highlands of Scotland are still quite poor. Why? Again, the lowlands have infrastructures that allow for markets. So they have roads, they have density, they have population. At that time, there is a major infrastructure activities in the sense that they are building canals, old like they're cutting canals, they're cutting across, they're building canals, so that again, there's a lot of access to markets. In the Highlands of Scotland, there's nothing. Like there's no roads. There's no way of transporting people and things that as effectively as the South. So I think that the comparison is more between North and South as opposed to Scotland and England.
Yes. No, I think that's totally true. And so talking about then this other part of how do we fix the problem of poverty? How do we address that is also, other later work parts of the book in volume 2 where he's talking about public works. And so we talked a little bit about standing army. I don't think we have talked about that more. I think we should talk about, justice, the administration of justice, and also education. And so would you mind kind of speaking more to his arguments there, which are both kind of criticizing certain systems in some places? That's where some of his critiques of ecclesiastical authorities come in, and religion and politics. But then there's also really a positive argument for education.
Let me start from education, and then the religious part comes sort of as a side. You do not find the kind of justification for education that we would find today. So today we would think, oh, we want an educated population because of the increase in human capital, right? And if like people with a higher human capital tend to be more productive, that helps economic growth. That's not in Smith. Smith cares about education, especially education, not especially, basically only about education of the poor. It doesn't worry about the education of the rich because they would be educated. Right? So that's not an issue. But the problem is education of the poor. And the reason why he cares about the education of the poor is because if the poor are not educated, they are, and I'm using like a word that is not very nice, but they're stupid. That's what Smith says, and they will lack judgment.
And this is to some degree worth underscoring because of also the specialization of menial labor.
Exactly. Again, you, if you are working poor, you start to work, Smith says, and the time is true, between the ages 6 or 8. And from the age of 6 or 8, you're working anything between 12 to 15 hours a day, doing exactly the same thing for 6 days a week. So he says, if you do it from 6 or 8 for 15 years, for 20 years, what mental capacity are you able to develop? Right? You have no critical skills. You have no ability to judge because you're doing exactly the same thing over and over again. You're not facing any problems that you have to solve. Like if you are in a farm, on the other hand, like you still start to work at 6. But nevertheless, there are so many things that can go wrong that you have to find a solution, that you develop the ability to figure out things. But if you instead are doing this repetitive work all the time, you are not able to develop any critical skills whatsoever. So you lack judgment, he says.
Yeah.
And what happens to people who lack judgment? They fall prey of political factions. And so there are higher chances of riots and political instability. And so what he wanted was to educate the poor so that they would actually be more um, critical and would be able to distinguish what is right and what is wrong politically and avoid rioting in the streets and being subject of factions that would just co-opt them to protest. So his his argument for education is for public safety, basically, more than anything else. So it's quite different from ours. If you want to have to interject, otherwise I continue with the religious part.
Well, I was just gonna add that to just connect it also, 'cause I loaded a lot in that question, so we should get into religious fact like the religious kind of demagogic, fanatical, sectarian leaders and that too. But also, he when we were talking earlier about kind of merchants and manufacturers and special interest groups capturing the state, that is also the problem is that these people, the workers will be easily manipulated and exploited by these groups to serve their employers. And he does also talk about how there are laws that make it harder for workers to collectively organize together, whereas it's easier for merchants to meet together in secret, even. And so he's suggesting that these kind of institutions shape these same dynamics of like collective action, and when the workers do agitate, it often doesn't they are often punished and they don't get what they want. And it's more often that they're used for someone else's interests rather than their own. So I just wanted to add that to there. But you should feel free to add to that or correct me. But also we can move on to the other. There are other people who are agitating and trying to capture people's interests.
No, but you're perfectly correct. The problem is that if a working poor would have a little bit more time, they would probably be able to develop those extra skills, critical skills. And this is why he favors public diversions, just so that like you actually are able to do something different than just doing the same thing over and over. And the merchant manufacturers have all the power to keep salaries as low as possible, which force them to work longer time. And Smith says the common argument that the manufacturers give for low salary is, oh, the poor are naturally not good people, and so if you pay them a lot, the natural laziness will emerge and will just devote themselves to debauchery, right? So they're gonna be drunk and do bad things. And so we should pay them as little as possible so that they can work all the time so that they will be virtuous people, or at least prevent them from being vicious. And Smith says, no, there's nothing wrong with them. They're not lazy. Is exactly the opposite. They if you do pay them more, they actually overwork, and so they are exhausted at the end of the week just because they work so hard. But if you actually pay them properly and let them rest, they would be more productive. So it would be actually in the recent interest of of the manufacturers to give them a fair wage and let them rest, but they're too close on themselves that to be able to see this and to accept it. So no, what you were saying is the other side is like why are they doing this for 12 hours a day? Well, because they have to.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good way to put it. Excellent. Yeah, no, and I don't know if you want to add to the we were talking about the religious component of his arguments for education.
A lot of educational institutions in Smith's time are religious, and that implies that the church is controlling the curriculum. And Smith says, why do we have to learn Latin? Right? There is no need to learn Latin. There is a much more need to learn astronomy, for example. But the church controls the curriculum, and so the church does what is best for the church and not what is best for the students or society. And so he condemns, and this is again is not primary level, like is a university level. So he condemns the church for or the institution that are linked to the higher education institution that are linked to the church as stagnant because they have no reason to innovate. They have no reason to adopt new things. And this is for both church and non-church universities. So university and and the church universities, the university that are controlled by the church have the same problem, which is lack of incentives for innovation. And that part of the reasons why he thinks that the Scottish educational system is superior to the English one, because the English one, the university are endowed, so professors are paid a fixed salary, and instead in Scotland, professors are paid by students, and so in order to attract students, they have to be innovative, and it's not an accident that Newton was taught first in Scotland and only much later in Cambridge, where he actually taught, right? Newtonianism, just because they had no reasons to adopt him. While Scotland instead were like, "Oh, this is new. Come and learn something new." The the church as an institution is a different problem, but is not necessarily linked with education. It's make a lot of negative things to say about the church as well.
Yeah, that might have to be its own
Its
episode,
own
and it
topic, exactly.
yeah, and but it's like but it follows on, I think, and so we don't need to go into it, but I think it follows on again the sort of way in which certain institutional incentives and interest can lead to worse outcomes. And so it's not so much Smith. There's a lot of ambiguity about what Smith's religious beliefs were, but it wasn't so much something that was against spirituality or religious belief, but it was kind of the mixing of religion with institutional incentives and politics and things like that. So maybe for another episode, but or if you want to add.
Yeah, no, what you're saying again, I agree 100%. Is the problem is that is criticizing in the Wealth of Nations is the institutional church. In the Wealth of Nation, it doesn't explicitly say anything about religion, or the problem is religiosity, which is fed through the church to support the established church. But yes, so the problem is the institution itself that wants to use again the power of the state to monopolize the religious market.
Great. So yeah, so now we have already gotten into some of these issues, but I want to again kind of frame it. We're going back to the really excellent biography you gave just to start us off. So brief, but so well detailed. And so one thing you mentioned was Smith's career as a customs officer. And so I wanted to more talk about Smith on trade, which is connected to what we were referring to as mercantilism, But Smith on trade versus kind of more protectionist policies that we again talked about before, with the sort of attempting to kind of reduce imports, encourage exports, that type of approach. And so sometimes I'll frame it this way though, because sometimes what people will talk about, there is this sort of like bumper, we say, political theory, like a bumper sticker Smith, of the Smith who's the champion of self interest, as you were talking about, the George Siegler famous quote of, wealth of nations as a stupendous palace erected upon the granite of self interest, and then this sort of early champion of what we now call capitalism, things like that. And then other people will, there's a lot of ways that people will nuance that are all valid. And but so then one example will be, well, he was actually very positive about, a very endorsed essentially the navigation acts, or also he acted as a customs officer. And I think, the broader point would be that Smith, we don't have his book on jurisprudence. We have his lectures, but he did have a third book plan that he asked to be burned on his deathbed, and would have been much more about the types of issues that we associate with politics, with which are included in Wealth of Nations. And I think also he added things that I think would have been there to the final edition of Theory of Moral Sentiments. But as a result, if we look at those things, it's more that Smith was very careful when it came to kind of prescriptions or politics. He was very aware of, you can't he was critical of the physiocrats, partly because he associated with them, in Wealth of Nations he attributes with them these people who in some ways he agreed with certain aspects, or he saw some similarities, or but he also disagreed with the idea of having some kind of top down blueprint for how society should be, and instead you have to make sure your policies are compatible with and make sense of how people will behave and how people will respond to them, and the existing established institutions and practices. Even as he criticized established institutions and practices, he was very careful about how one would imagine policy, what it should look like, and how to implement that. And that this is sort of, you should feel free to respond and criticize anything I've said. But I wanted to maybe, yeah, if you could take us a little bit more in that direction of Smith as customs officer, the sort of debates around how should we make sense of Smith when it comes to his arguments there of, even though he's criticizing state capture, there is room for state action.
So let me first start with a couple of caveats. He never used the word capitalism. He never used the word laissez-faire. And again, he used self-interest once, not referring to the way in which we usually refer to. So I have like a sort of uncomfortable reaction every time I hear Smith is the father of capitalism, or somehow associated with capitalism, just because it's like you never talk about capitalism. I don't even know what capitalism is, so I would just like push it on the side. Um, but that's just like my personal like uncomfort with the word capitalism, and but at the same time, he never used the word laissez-faire, and he has a very long list of government intervention that he favors. Like you mentioned, Navigation Act is just one of the many, right? But there are several scholars that list them out and say, how is it possible that Smith, who's in favor of laissez-faire, has all this government intervention? And it's true, like there's a long list of government intervention that he favors, including like working for the custom office, which is like collecting tariffs basically. And I just don't see the problem. I mean, I see the problem if it is presented as a caricature.
Yeah.
So the Smith caricature is Smith is laissez-faire, Smith is capitalist promoter, whatever that means. But if that is not the case, then there is not a contradiction to the fact that he favors the Navigation Acts, and he works for the custom officer. And I'm saying this because he's very careful in distinguishing state interventions, and he's not blanketing saying every state intervention is bad. What he's saying is there are some state interventions that are necessary and some state interventions that are driven by special interest groups that are nefarious. So what you need to do is to look at who is beyond that government intervention. And if you find that there is a special interest group, if you find that that intervention benefits some at the expense of others, then you should be very, very, very worried about adopting it because it will cause more harm than anything else. That said, there are some interventions that have to be taken by the government if you want a good society. So he gives the example of party walls. Party walls are walls that partition properties. And again, think of 18th century Britain, London, like very densely populated city. Houses are made mostly of wood. You have fire to light the house. You have fire to warm the house. You have fire to cook. That means that the probability of your house catching fire is actually relatively high. But if your house is next to another house that is wood, then the entire London burns down, right? So what do? You force these partitions among properties. There are walls that prevent the fire from going from one property to the other. In this way, if my house burns down, I don't burn down the entire city. As Smith says, these party walls are violation of liberty, but they're necessary, right? Nobody wants them, but they have to be there for the well-being of society. And so what Smith is doing with a lot of his proposed state intervention is saying, yeah, I know this is a violation of individual liberty, but it's necessary. And that's a very different intervention than an intervention that is designed to benefit me, even if it hurts you. So the one party wall that it describes is the banning on small denomination notes, right? So small denomination notes are usually used to pay the working poor, but because they are small denomination, we don't pay too much attention to who the issuer is because who cares if a dollar is fake, right? But the problem is that if the issuer of those notes goes bankrupt, the working poor are left with nothing. And that's a disaster for them. So even if they're willing to accept it, even if the banker is willing to be a banker, it is better not to have it because if something goes wrong, and something may very well go wrong, then the working poor will be devastated. Like, so those are the kind of intervention that Smith sees as beneficial. And so you need to have certain interventions to make sure that things actually work smoothly. The condemnation are the intervention like I want to protect um, the manufacturing of wool. Like that is something that is no nonsense because everybody has to pay a higher price for wool and a lower quality, right? And that is a policy designed to benefit a very specific group, but it hurts everybody else in society. And so if you look at all the interventions that he favors are all interventions that benefit overall society or the most vulnerable, like in the case of the working poor. So I think it is his positions are very context dependent. Now you can't have a functioning government without a revenue,
Yeah.
and so you do need to tax something. And it's difficult to figure out what is the best way to tax. But money has to come from somewhere to pay for some basic services. And so it's okay to tax certain things. Again, as long as the tax is not meant to explicitly restrict a market.
Yeah, his tax policy is very interesting, the arguments he has about taxes, how much he's also critical of things that are what we would call, like, regressive taxation. He's critical of collecting taxes based on essentially hearths, within the home and how that's a violation of privacy, but then he's also acknowledging that when you tax based on windows, then there you might actually have exacerbate the problem of inequality of, wealthy people own apartments in the cities and they have less windows than, a person in the countryside, a poor person in the countryside, or otherwise. So he's always talking about this sort of, I want to be careful about, equality or equity. We mean it in different terms, but that is a principle that he's bringing in when he's talking about tax policy, which is, I think, helpful and underscores your point about the concern for the vulnerable, the concern for like all of society when we're thinking about these interventions. I also wanted to kind of connect to that a little bit because I just know that you have work on this. I think often we think about Smith as an economist, and we think about Smith as talking about, trade and tax. And it's not that these aren't related, but I really appreciated your recent work on Smith on warfare and public debt and financing. And so I wonder if you could kind of just give us more of that. Because I don't know, I guess sometimes I get a little frustrated because sometimes when I interact with people who I love that they reject the sort of Smith as laissez-faire economist, but then they'll kind of hook on to these other parts of Smith that they kind of simplify, which is things like the standing army or and I think that there's a lot of nuance there. And so I wondered if, how should we think of like Smith as a theorist of war?
Smith favors a standing army differently from many of his contemporaries. You mentioned the poker club before. That was like a common topic. And the reason why he favors a standing army is because in a commercial society, and again, this has to be specified, is in a commercial society, a standing army is more effective than a militia. And the reason is a commercial society is a society that has division of labor. And the military is a job in a sense, like any other. And so it is good to have people who specialize in defense, just like it is good to have people who specialize in making pins. And so his logic is in a commercial society, a standing army is more effective than militia, only in a commercial society. So again, different material conditions, different will give you different institutions that are more appropriate for that context. So in a pastoral society, having a standing army for him would make no sense for several reasons. One of the reason is, in a pastoral society, everybody is basically a soldier, just because like you're so accustomed to the harshness of being outside and the strength of doing things outside that everybody is already trained as a soldier. In a commercial society, that's not the case. You need to have people who are specifically trained to obey orders. You need to have people who are trained to use weapons that are different. They're very noisy, they're very scary. So you need to have discipline to handle those weapons as opposed to brute physical force, which does not require as much discipline. And most importantly, if you do have a standing army, you have people who do not work in the sense that do not produce their food or their clothes. So they need to be paid. And the only nations that are able to pay for a standing army are rich nations. So commercial societies, like a pastoral society, would not have the funds necessary to support a standing army. So the standing army argument is dependent on commercial societies, and it is for Smith is the appropriate military establishment for a commercial society. Now, the other problem that you have with commercial society for Smith, and you mentioned public debt, is that you do have public debt. And it is easy to have public debt because, again, a commercial society is a rich society. That means that people have a lot of funds that they don't use, and they're more than happy to lend. And so they can lend it to the government. So the government can actually have a public debt. A pastoral society will never have public debt just because like there's nobody has enough funds to lend to the sovereign or to the government or whomever. And so the possibility to have public debt allows for the government to spend um, in a way that is not necessarily visible because you use that as opposed to taxation. So you don't feel the fact that you are actually facing a large bill. That allows, according to Smith, allows the government to engage in more wars and longer wars than in the past. And now, why would the government engage in more wars than in the past? Because of special interest groups. Right. So this is like the criticism that Smith gives of the British Empire. The British Empire is built on military strength, of military actions. And military actions are dictated by special interest group that says you have to fight to open this market for me. You have to fight to defend this route for me. And so Smith is saying all these wars that Britain is facing in the last centuries are all driven by special interest groups, and they are able to do it exactly because of the presence of public debt. Because if you go to tax for the amount that is needed to finance the war would end immediately. But because you don't see the cost and you're far away from the battlefield has this amazing image for me and says like people sit in their comfy chairs in London reading the newspapers and dreaming of empire, and then they are upset when the war ends because they have no form of entertainment, and that is because again they don't face the bill. So it has a again, this is another side of this like violent attack against the commercial system of Britain that incentivize the special interest group are the source of conflicts, of international conflicts.
And it gets to the point that the book again, why that sort of caricature of Smith is so inaccurate is people might then think, oh, the state is the big bad, and no, not that it's not that he's not critical of the state. He's critical of so many established institutions, but these dynamics, these political economic dynamics, aren't just explained by political power in the formal sense and in the sort of state institutions. People occupy the state institutions, the monarchy, but it's also about the private interests that are able to use politics and would be, so it's not just I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a complexity to how you think about the state and whether or not you could really imagine a kind of minimal state being what does that actually look like if you're going to also curtail the power of special interests to drive warfare or what we would say not to we're trying to avoid contemporary stuff, but what we would call like the military industrial complex or something like that.
So one interesting thing for me at least is that Smith does criticize government and says politicians, but not because they're greedy, but because they're ignorant. Like they have no idea what they're doing, and they
They're
are
easily manipulated.
exactly,
So
exactly.
sorry.
And because basically nobody's elected. I mean, there's some sort of voting, but there's basically nobody's elected. They have no problem in say, oh, I need to please my constituencies, but they need to keep population calm, right? And so the Smith says that the politician can be intimidated by special interest group, right? Because the special interest group are able to mobilize a lot of the stupid working poor, right, to riot in the streets and cause violence, and so the politicians, in a sense, are sort of puppets in the hands of special interest groups.
No, excellent. I mean, very sad, but also I think it's a good summation of exactly what the kind of claims that he's making are, and I think again they're more nuanced than people might know, which is really great. Um, yeah, I think is there anything that oh, you know what? Actually, before we go, I did want to kind of sum and I think it's all clear from what we were talking about, but I just wanted to underscore kind of like your appreciation for, and I remember you giving a talk, I think it was at our Markets and Society, where you talked about, this book being about justice and it's a normative project, as in it's about kind of what we would, ethical and moral values and, not just kind of this descriptive account of economics, but it's a more political and ethical oriented book. I wondered if you could just speak on that because I think that's a good note to end with. And anything else you'd like to add?
Again, this is just like my personal opinion there. And everything I said so far is like my view. There's a lot of many different views on what the wealth of nation is and what it stands for. But because of the way I'm reading the wealth of nations as so in a more public choice key. I see it more as a normative book. So the violent attack against the commercial system of Britain is a normative condemnation of the system. So yeah, there is a positive analysis that sustain the normative problem that he sees with the British Empire, and it is a description of what goes on, but is not a neutral description. Is a description that is made with strong, again, negative terms. And it's not just efficiency, is like you're doing the wrong thing. It's condemnable what you're doing, big merchants and manufacturers. And in that sense, I see the book as a normative book as opposed to the theory of moral sentiments, where I see it more as a positive book because it's a description of how we develop our morals, and it doesn't tell you this is the morals that you're supposed to adopt, right? It doesn't tell you this is right, this is wrong. It just says this is how you are able to function in the society in a way that is considered appropriate. And so that's like for me the theory of moral sentiments is more positive in that sense. But yeah, I see that the wealth of nations as a moral condemnation of special interest groups and the capture of the state. Again, my personal view that there are
Yeah,
people that,
well,
that they take very different things from the book, which is part of the joy of the book, right? Because
yes.
it allows people to read it in very different ways.
Exactly, and I think with this podcast, I think I trust my audience to I mean, we articulated too that this is everybody's personal kind of perspectives, and we wanna share those, but I would say, I really appreciate and am grateful for your personal perspective because I do think that's a really great I guess what I would say also is that any book, people are gonna receive it, interpret it in so many different ways. Like, everybody has their own reading and interpretation, but also that's what makes, pluralism so valuable in terms of embracing there being these different interpretations. Because I think there's always for me when I'm trying to explain Smith, there are some ways in which that caricature of Smith is very wrong, but also it's based on real parts of the text too. There are real parts of the text where he's talking about it again from our perspective it resembles something like some rational choice theory type arguments, let's say. But, that is oversimplifying, of course. And so we have to also be very careful about that. But that is why you want all these other interpretations too. And so sometimes I'm sure I'm sure there's interpretations unlike yours that are way more out there, but are still very valuable. Whereas yours, I think, is actually really core to also the truth of the text of at that time in that context, he doesn't have the same norms that we have around writing a book. It can be both very much examination of an analytical puzzle and a moral condemnation of the current system and of established authorities and institutions. And I think there's a way in which we have some fields in academia of people able to do that and also kind of in society, but there's also a lot of ways in which we've moved so far into this other direction that it's hard for us to articulate that. And that is why really foregrounding the idea that this is a normative book, that this is about justice, that it relates to concerns about power. I would say even in public choice. I mean, not always, but some papers, some work in public choice can sometimes feel like the power question is actually too far in the background, even though it is. I think someone like Buchanan. I think he's motivated by that, but it's not always so clear and in the foreground. But then when you put it alongside Smith, when you look at Smith and you see that this is also, I think, an inspirational text for a lot of these people, you see that justice, front and center in the foreground, unavoidably so, and things about power, about inequality, about domination that I think are crucial for us to be talking about today, and both as a matter of understanding history too.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, you were an excellent guide through the Wealth of Nations. I was just reading about Dante's Inferno, which I haven't read, but and I'm thinking of you as like our Virgil through Wealth of Nations, and it's like it's history and it's really great. So thank you so much. Is there anything you want to add, anything you're excited about with this anniversary of Wealth of Nations, or anything we didn't get to speak about?
First of all, I would like to deeply thank you for this. It's been a great pleasure and a lot of fun to do it. And I hope that more people actually pick up the book and read it in this occasion, given that it's 250, because a lot of people either cite without having read, or maybe buy the book just to have it on the shelf. So it's
Yeah.
like open the book and read part of it. Part of it are excruciatingly difficult and excruciatingly boring, but there's a lot of fun in it as well.
I agree completely. And you got to, I will say when you're getting through it and there are some more boring parts, but then there'll be something really cool and interesting pretty soon after that. So that's stick with it, and it's not as intimidating as it might seem.
Exactly.
Well, thank you again. It really was wonderful to talk to you as always, and I really think that this will be a great service to people this year as people encounter the book. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity. It's been great.
I'm so grateful that Maria took the time to talk with us and guide us through Wealth of Nations. If you enjoyed this episode, let me first recommend an episode with philosopher Eric Schlieser, which discussed his work on Adam Smith back in the second season of this podcast in 2025. Soon we'll have another episode on Smith, his legacy, and the politics of commemoration with Glory Liu. Let me conclude, as usual, with a few final points that recap what we discussed in this episode. We talked about Smith's theory of self-interest and how his anthropology, or theory of human nature, and his economic theory based on it is much more complicated than some readers can characterize. Interest is not the only motivator for human beings, according to Smith. We are deeply intersubjective, empathetic, and capable of compassion and generosity for others. But the environments we find ourselves in, informal and formal institutions, our material prosperity or lack thereof, heavily shape our choices, actions, and broader social norms. So Smith's work, both this and his other writings, are preoccupied with the institutions and conditions that bring out the best and minimize the worst in human beings. Smith's answer to the puzzle of what causes the wealth of nations was how people's access to markets enabled specialization through the division of labor and increasing productivity and wealth for all. It's worth emphasizing that these benefits of markets are conditional on these processes being those of fair and deliberate exchange. Smith's clear, for example, that European colonization and the trading of people in the slave trade were themselves unjust projects of cruelty and domination. Thus, for Smith, justice is important, and the idea of institutions that have a proper administration of justice, which includes public action, is crucial for an effective political economy. Smith's positive vision of markets was a response to what he saw as a poorly constituted political economy, later referring to this text as a very violent attack upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. This system, which he referred to as mercantilism, emphasized maximizing the money held by the country, particularly by maximizing exports and minimizing imports. The major problem for Smith was one of power. Merchants exploited political institutions to pursue policies that could best personally enrich them while allowing them to exert domination. As Maria said, these policies could be tariffs, subsidies, treaties that gave merchants monopolies over foreign markets. Smith's point was not that someone wasn't getting rich from these policies. The point was that the British Empire's wealth grew despite monopolies. And to put a finer point on it, these monopolies further enabled the deeply unjust and cruel practices that plagued the world in this historical moment. I want this episode to really serve as a guide to Smith's text. So I'm sticking primarily to history to trying to understand Smith in his own words, but I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that today we see a lot of debates and a lot of arguments for protectionism, including tariffs and other policies. Many of those who argue for these policies justify them with the rhetoric of the common good, even rhetoric of being pro-worker. So while I am going to set aside debates about recent trade policies, whether those are neoliberal or neo-mercantilist, the degree to which either of these resemble or contradict Smith's theory, I do want to make sure that we get at least one thing straight about Smith's political economy. The entire text is full of concern for the poor and critiques of the powerful, and his rejection of mercantilism or protectionism was no different. So I'm going to review a few pages that we'll have in the show notes as well that I'll add here, and that we will also be discussing in the future episodes that we have, especially one with Glory Liu. So according to Smith, producers, merchants, employers of the poor not only lobbied, to use our term, for tariffs and subsidies, or bounties as he called them, but also lobbied for exemptions to tariffs that would benefit them. Smith suggested that these exemptions could often be just, and it makes sense because he was so critical of protectionism. He would suggest that these exemptions could be important. But because the system was so profoundly unequal and essentially dominated by the wealthiest manufacturers, the exceptions often served to enrich them further while harming the poorest domestic workers, and not just the ones that they directly employed. So, according to Smith, manufacturers would lobby for a patchwork of subsidies on exports, tariffs on imports, that would enable them to reduce foreign competition for their finished goods, while at the same time, policies that would allow free importing of the raw materials, such as linen yarn, that they needed to produce these goods in the first place. In doing so, mercantilist policies indirectly undercut the wages of domestic spinners, most commonly poor women. As Smith concluded this passage, it is the industry which is carried on for the benefit of the rich and the powerful that is principally encouraged by our mercantile system. That which is carried on for the benefit of the poor and the indigent is too often either neglected or oppressed. So, in short, this episode sought to see how Smith, the social critic, gives us a theory of how private interests, particularly of those people who held the most social and economic power, easily captured the 18th century state. With this episode, thanks to Maria's helpful guidance, I've tried to stick to the text, though if you're like me, you already have thoughts brewing about how Smith's work might resonate with debates in our own time. These themes of power, state capture, inequality, and how to imagine systems that will benefit ordinary people have always been a part of Virtual Sentiments, and we'll continue to discuss them throughout the season, looking ahead to guests such as Samuel Bagg, Glory Liu, Henry Farrell, and many more. Thanks so much for joining us. It is a pleasure to be back. Till next time.